Hey guys, in this podcast we talk about different health topics. As we are not medical experts, we would ask for you to check with your doctor first before using any of the information provided in this podcast. Furthermore, we talk about third-party views in this podcast. Please know that we have no intention of misrepresenting them, and we apologize in advance if we do so. Thanks.
Hey guys, what's up? We're going with another Contemplation and Hypothezation podcast. Paul, what are we talking about today?
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about a mix of psychology and logic.
Okay.
And the topic today are logical fallacies. I mentioned in the last podcast on economic fallacies, I wanted to talk about logical fallacies because logical fallacies are much more like practical and we can use them in our daily life to alter the way we make decisions.
Okay, so what do you mean by logical fallacies?
Okay, so in the last podcast, an economic fallacy was sort of something that appears logical, but it has a hole in it. And because that hole, if we believe these things, there's unforeseen consequences.
So it's something that seems true, but in reality it's not.
It's not true. And one of the reasons why we're so susceptible to logical fallacies is because our brain has these mechanisms called heuristics that are used to shorten our, acting as shortcuts to our cognitive processes.
Yeah, and that's actually a big field for artificial intelligence. A lot of people try to program computers to do certain actions, and they can't because they don't have those shortcuts that we have, and we're trying to figure those out right now. So it's a really big deal where you take your shortcuts because depending on where you make your shortcuts, that's where an error can be made.
Right. And so the thing that you'll see about heuristics is that we don't have an evolutionary process that makes them logical. So they are sort of pitfalls in our logic. So let me talk briefly about a couple of examples of what heuristics are. A common heuristic is called anchoring and adjustment. And so what this is people have a common tendency, and it's a shortcut, to choose the first thing that comes to mind and stick with it. So I'm going to use an example of chess because right now I'm training for chess tournaments and stuff because I think it really illustrates this heuristic in motion. So when you play checkers or chess or whatever game you're playing, oftentimes when it's your turn to make a move, you will look at the board and you'll find a piece and you'll decide, am I going to move this piece or not?
Okay.
And then in your head, you find all these justifications. Like, should I move this piece? If I move this piece here, then he does this. If I move this piece here, then he does this.
So let's say the first move is pawn e5 or something like that.
Yeah.
All right, so that's your first move. And you're saying that you have to evaluate all these steps ahead. Like, what will happen if you do the e5 move?
Well,
right.
Sort of. What more I'm saying is that we have this propensity to pick one move and analyze that one move while neglecting to look at the other ones and giving a fair share of time to those. So another example would be like a doctor. He was listening to a patient describe his symptoms. The doctor might get some inclination that maybe it's the flu.
Right.
And that inclination that it's the flu is part he will stick to and.
But in reality, it might be appendicitis or it might be something completely different. But because he thought of flu first,
because whatever you think of first,
you try to stick to. Exactly.
Right, exactly.
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
And so on checkers, you pick a move first, and you tend to stick to it and look at why that's a good move, instead of evaluating each piece on the board and determining whether another move would be just as good.
Yeah, checkers or chess.
Yeah, and so that's just a natural mechanism that our brain has that shortcuts the amount of time that we have to spend on things. But as you can see, it's not very logical.
And also, this kind of goes into arguments a lot. Like when you're in a heated argument, it's either your way or the highway, and that's because it's your way that you thought of first.
Right.
And so that's why you're not very open to other ways or other methods you can solve the problem from other people.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah. So what is that whole thing called? What is the name of that? Like that first theory go? Is there a name?
Anchoring and adjustment.
Gotcha.
That's the heuristic name for it.
Gotcha.
So another example of a heuristic is the availability heuristic, and that's basically that the more available information is to you, the more likely you think that whatever that information is actually going on. So let me explain that a little bit. That was kind of
in English,
shaky.
please. Yeah.
So let's say you watch the news every night, and on the news every night they show these crimes being committed. Like there was this murder, there was this mugging, there was this rape, and there were all these different things on the news.
Gotcha.
Because you see it, and because the information is so available to you, you evaluate it as it's much more likely than it really is.
Oh, okay, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So the presence of information, even if it's over exaggerated, may not actually be that exaggerated in real life, but because it was presented to you in over exaggerated fashion, it is. So if it's all over the news, let's say for example, there's car accidents occurring, and in reality, there's not that many car accidents per people, but you just always see them on the news, and you always hear people talking about it. Then you would think car accidents happen to everyone.
They're very likely, and so I need to take precautions to avoid them. So you can see how this mechanism can be useful because we're preparing for a situation that seems common, but it's not logical because these crimes or these car crashes don't really happen to that many people.
And this is like the advertisement dream, right? Because what they do is they just bombard you with their products, saying, "Yeah, everyone's drinking Pepsi, so." Therefore, if everyone's drinking Pepsi, maybe it's a good idea, right? Or whatever product, doesn't matter. I mean, Pepsi's not the only one doing this, but the more you see of it, the more availability.
The more you think it's to be true.
Right.
So, I have a great example of this. I read this book a while back that was about paranoia in the United States and how we are a society that is paranoid.
Okay.
And part of that is perpetuated by the media. So, in the last 20 years, the murder rate has gone down substantially.
Okay.
From the 20 years prior.
Right. Yeah.
But the availability of media coverage covering these murder cases has gone up 400%. Now, I might be
wow.
off on these statistics because I read the book a while ago. So
And they're averages, I'm sure.
these are averages, yeah. So the amount that we encounter information regarding these murders has gone up 400%.
Wow.
So it makes it appear as though murdering is more likely. If you ask someone today if the murder rate has gone up or down, they're most likely going to say it's gone up. But that's just because they've had more media exposure to it.
Yeah.
And so that's a perfect example of how this happens. Is when we encounter information more, we assume that it takes up a greater percentage of probability than we would normally.
Yeah, and
assess.
so actually I think what this means, how you can use this, is you want to surround yourself by the influences that you want to become. So if you're always surrounded by information that you want to be like, for example, if you're always surrounded in an academic environment, let's say you want to be, a great professor one day, and if your friends are like, all academia driven, and they're always presenting you like what you're going to talk about on Friday night is like the latest quantum mechanical theory or something, the whole
like
point
us.
is, except we're not there yet. So the problem is that you will eventually, because you're hearing that more often, you will actually think in general, oh, actually more people actually talk about this than I thought. It's not this rare little group that hasn't developed around the world.
So basically, you're saying like if you surround yourself with success, for example, then you're gonna sort of develop the perception that success is much more common than it even is necessarily.
And this is like a big thing on Reddit too. Reddit's like another really good example because you have a subreddit and you'll see thousands of people on the subreddit. But the topic might be something very, very small, like medicine, for example. They call it Medit on Reddit. But the whole point is that there's not, you might see thousands of people looking at this, and the traffic is huge. But if you compare that to the overall traffic of the world, it's nothing. But in your perception, seeing thousands of comments on just one post, that's amazing. You just think everyone's looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely. And so basically, to sum it up, like we have these heuristics that cause these pitfalls in our logic. And today we want to get into what these pitfalls are and how we can avoid them.
Okay.
To start off, like one of the reasons why you learn logical fallacies is so that like when you're debating an idea with someone, you're able to keep the conversation logical.
Gotcha.
Like one thing you have to recognize is that human beings are emotional beings. We're emotional and social creatures. So like when I do something like break up with my girlfriend or something, then
which I do on a daily basis. Yeah.
I do that. Yes, I do it often. But when I do something like break up with my girlfriend, I might have all these reasons in my head to why I did it. But the primary reason is most likely emotional. I just didn't feel the same way when I was with her as I did before. But humans have a tendency to make emotional decisions and then come up with rational decisions to why so. So maybe in my head, I think to myself, okay, I broke up with her because maybe we live too far away. Maybe she's changed a lot. But none of that is really why I broke up with her. Mainly, I broke up with her because I just wasn't feeling the same way when I was with her. So that would be an example. But it's like this all the time with all sorts of decisions.
Well, let me ask you this then, counter argument. How do you separate the rational from the emotional? Like maybe because her personality changed, you feel differently towards her,
right,
and therefore it actually was a rational reason. Like how do you distinguish?
That's like a great question, and I think that the first answer I would say is it's incredibly challenging to separate the two. Oftentimes our rationalizations may be correct. Maybe that is a reason, but what's important to notice is that the thing that caused it was an emotion, and then we're trying to piece together that emotion logically, but our emotions aren't always so logical. So very well maybe that was the case.
Yeah. One thing I want to comment on this, just because it's a medicine case, is you use emotions to make decisions. So what I mean by that is there are different diseases that are very unfortunate where people don't have emotions. Like they can observe a pen is red and observe a pen is black, and that they observe they need to sign a document, but because they don't have emotions, they can't decide which pen to use because they're equally valuable to them.
Oh, that's interesting.
So the thing is that emotions actually drive your decision. Like you can be a computer and you can calculate all these options what to do, but the only way you can actually decide a decision is if you have an emotional value to something. Mm-hmm. Computers just use numbers, whatever the highest number is, you use that. But the whole point is with humans is that you use emotion to actually make your final decision.
Wow. Okay, that's really interesting.
So
basically, like when we're arguing, we often resort to emotional arguments instead of rational arguments. And I mean, it should be obvious why that's a problem, because emotion is not a good reason to do something most of the time, or a good reason to believe something. Now, I'm not saying that we can avoid emotion entirely, but I'm saying when we want to look at a thing objectively, logic is going to be our best solution.
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha.
So a way in which people bring emotion into an argument is called, one of those ways is an ad-hominem. An ad-hominem is basically a personal attack.
Okay.
So if I'm arguing with you, let's say we're arguing to whether pro-life is good or not.
Okay.
I could say, well, I don't believe Nick's position because Nick still believes in Santa Claus. So because he still believes in Santa Claus, there's no way he's going to be right about this abortion argument. So I'm attacking you while avoiding discussing the actual topic at hand.
Right.
And so because we're emotional beings, this has an effect on us. When we're personally attacked, the idea is that we are going to become less intelligent in our responses and things of that nature. And so it can give the perception that someone's winning an argument when they attack, but it's entirely illogical because yes,
Right.
Nick could still believe in the tooth fairy, but what he's saying about abortion and pro-life could be completely correct
Right.
and completely true, and what I'm saying could be wrong.
Right, wow,
So
yeah.
a personal attack is not a good way to argue. And so when you're in a debate with someone and they start attacking you personally, you need to step back and say like, hey, this is an ad hominem.
Yeah.
You're just attacking my person. You're not attacking my argument, and therefore what you say about me should have no impact on what my argument is.
Wow. And I'm sure politics takes advantage.
Politics
all
does
the time.
all the time. Yeah.
Okay.
And so like a general principle in philosophy is this idea called the principle of charity. The principle of charity, and it's this idea that when we debate someone, we assume that they, we look at their position from at the highest level, not at the position that they preach it or whatever. Sorry
Okay.
for
So,
that.
so you're saying that sometimes you can do the opposite effect where somebody is not that good at something, but yet you consider them to be very, very elite.
We look at their position from the like most advanced argument form. So I think the best way to explain it would be to look at an example. So
Sure.
let's say I'm arguing with you about whether seatbelts are good.
Okay.
And you are just awful at arguing this position.
Yeah.
Like you don't know my response. You don't know how to respond to any of the arguments I'm saying. Now
Okay.
should I base my belief on whether seatbelts are bad just on our argument between us about the seatbelts? No, I should compare my arguments to those who are more educated and who hold the position most strongly.
Okay. So you're saying just because you win against one person doesn't mean you've won the argument.
Yeah,
you
just
haven't proven
you
something.
haven't shown any more value to your position until you compare it to the most intelligent holder of that position.
Okay, gotcha.
And so that kind of gets like when we're talking about ad hominems and personal attacks, like that's one reason why you should avoid ad hominems, because when you attack a person, even if you attack them and show that their argument's not very strong, it doesn't mean that the position they hold is not actually a strong position.
Gotcha. Okay.
So
Wow.
an ad hominem is one of the first one. Another argument that people resort to often is an argument from authority.
Okay.
Have you ever?
So like a boss, like the boss type of thing, boss situation in a company. Like, do you mind explain it?
Yeah, sure. So let's say we were debating the prevalence of global warming or something.
Yeah.
And we're talking about very specific numbers.
Okay.
Now you could add to the conversation that Professor XYZ said this, and therefore what I am saying is not true. Now right here, what you're doing is appealing to authority. You're saying because Professor XYZ says this, it therefore must be true, and what I'm saying must be false. You're avoiding what we're actually discussing about to add in an appeal to authority. Now, obviously, when you examine this, appealing to authority is not like a terrible thing.
Right, yeah.
Sometimes an authority has more information about the topic
Right.
than you do. But oftentimes what happens in an argument or a debate is that someone will appeal to authority to kind of and use it as a scapegoat to avoid
Yeah.
arguing what's actually there. So they'll say,
Right.
Richard Dawkins doesn't believe in God, so why should you believe in it? Instead of
Right.
answering the questions which are at hand right
Oh,
now.
okay, I see. So it's kind of, you use it as an escape, but because they're such a well-known or well-respected person and they have a clear opinion, you kind of escape the actual arguments leading up to the result, but you just explain, well, this person has this result, so obviously it's right. Like, we don't need to debate this.
Yeah. And so, but obviously we can see the logical fallacies because the authority figure might be wrong. And at the end of the day, you're just using it as a scapegoat to avoid what's being discussed at the moment,
Yeah.
which is more important to what a professional thinks.
Yeah, and also this is like a huge thing in company culture. A lot of times you don't want to upset the boss, but the best companies have bosses that don't punish people for questioning them. The best bosses, in my opinion, are the people that say, if you think I'm doing something wrong, please let me know. I'm not going to fire you. In fact, I welcome your criticism. And most often, the people who are actually dealing with the situation at the forefront have a better perspective, have more available information, and then they get back to the boss, and the boss says, oh yeah, you're right. I'm glad you got that to me. But I think a big reason why bosses don't do that is like a pride issue. I've worked 25 years in this company. I'm finally head manager. I don't want you who just showed up. You've only been working here for a year. You don't know what you're talking about in terms of that engine design. I've been here for 25 years, So,
Well, that actually goes into a lot of what we're talking about, like defense mechanisms,
Right, yeah.
and how self-analysis is difficult because social groups rarely actually present you with what's happening objectively. Like that's why people have very illusional beliefs about themselves because people don't tell them what they actually see.
Yeah.
When you're a person of authority, people are even more scared of criticizing you because criticizing you could mean losing their job.
Right.
And actually, the point you bring up that like very effective like CEOs or managers are ones that have like an open door policy has been studied tremendously, and it's been shown to be true. Like I talked about a book, it's called From Good to Great, and it examined the top 10 companies, and this list of 10 companies fit a very tight criteria for success, and they considered these companies to be the most successful in the history of America. And one quality that they saw of all their CEOs was this open door policy where you're free to criticize, you're free to make judgments, but you need to discuss them and use them as feedback.
Yeah, but the thing is obviously if you're in a work environment and your boss isn't very open to criticism, there's not much you can actually do. You can do different tactics like seek first understand, but we'll talk about that on our podcast. But the whole point is that this really has to stem from the boss. And a lot of people are like, well, there's nothing I can do about that now. But 25 years from now, when you actually are the boss, remember that. Remember the open door policy. Your company will have more success. But anyways,
Definitely. So Another type of argument, another type of fallacy that's common is the slippery slope fallacy. And this is basically where you argue that because we're accepting one part of the argument, that we therefore are accepting the most extreme version of that argument. So the last podcast on sleep, I discussed why I think they should push back the arrival time for teenagers in high school. And I said that it was beneficial to their biological clocks. Like waking up at 7 o'clock is terrible for kids whose melatonin production doesn't stop till 8 a.m. So they should at least push it back till 9. The slippery slope fallacy would be if someone was arguing with me and they said, well, if we push it back to 9, why don't we just keep pushing it back to 10, 11, and why don't we just start school at 11 p.m.?
Oh, okay, I see. And so you're saying you're just exaggerating, or 11 a.m.
But you're just saying that it keeps going.
Yeah.
And in many cases, it could be like this. Like recently in New York, they limited the size that you could sell like a certain like soda drink.
Huh, okay.
I think it's like now like 20 ounces is like the maximum. Like they don't sell 32-ounce drinks. So you could argue, okay, if they start limiting the size of Coke, then what stops them from limiting the size of a French fry or the size of a burger?
Right.
And as you can see, it's a valid form of argument. But what's important to notice the difference between the fallacy and the argument is when there's no reason to push it any further. So in the example of the school, 9 o'clock, there's no reason to go to 10 o'clock. And I'm not arguing in any sense for that.
Right.
I'm saying that 10 o'clock is the most ideal. So it's important to recognize what they are arguing specifically before you use a slippery slope type argument.
Gotcha. Okay. So basically the whole point is try to identify to what extent the person is arguing for and why they're arguing for that extent, and see if it encourages it more or if it's just stopping right there.
Right. Because if you realize that they are just stopping right there, then to make this argument that's going to keep going is just to completely misunderstand the data.
Gotcha.
And it's a weak argument. So another fallacy, and this is probably my favorite fallacy, is called the gambler's fallacy.
Okay.
Are you familiar with this?
No. All new information.
So just picture this like little scenario. You're playing what's the game? Let's just say you're rolling dice, all right? And
Yahtzee.
you roll a dice, Yahtzee. You roll your first dice and it's a 6. You roll your second dice and it's a 6. You roll your third, it's a 6. Fourth, it's a 6. Now it's your fifth roll, and you say to yourself, well, I've just rolled 4 sixes in a row.
Yeah.
So it's pretty unlikely that the next one will be a 6.
Well, yeah, okay.
Right?
Right, yeah.
But the fallacy is that it's just as likely as it was on the last roll, and it's just as likely as it was on the roll before.
Right. And 21, the movie, took advantage of this. They kind of try to explain that more in detail. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, 21 was about counting cards and stuff,
Right.
blackjack. But so the fallacy is that because like an event has occurred a certain number of times, that event is therefore less probable or more probable when in fact the probability remains exactly the same.
Wow. Okay.
So if I flip a spinner on that says like yes or no, and it just constantly lands on yes, it's still a 50% chance next time I spin it that it will land on yes.
Right.
No matter how many times previously it has landed on yes.
Now, I think, do we have a real life application or example of this? Because I think what happens with real life is it gets clouded by different external factors that might influence
Yes.
it.
So a real life example, this is a very important fallacy when dealing with the stock market, especially, and casino gambling. So in the stock market, what happens is you say, oh, this stock has been going up for a long time. It's inevitable that it's going to go down.
Right.
Well, that stock could continue to just go up pretty much infinitely.
Yeah.
Unless there's like inferential data that suggests that it might go down, there's no reason to think that just because it's had this upward trend that it's going to experience a downward trend.
Oh.
So stock market people fall victim to this all the time. They see a stock and they notice like, I think the most common is like they notice a trend in the stock. They do some data mining and they say like, okay, this stock goes up and then it goes down. It goes up to a little higher level, then it goes down a little bit higher.
Yeah.
It goes up to an even higher level, then it goes down. And they take that previous knowledge and then use that to make a better decision. But it doesn't show that past data has no influence on the current event. It could keep going up or it could hit rock bottom.
Right.
And
Or flatline.
Yeah. And so if you invest in that money based on these past events that have no they do not affect the stock market. I mean, you could argue that they affect it a little bit because of the confidence of stock purchasers and stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Right.
But if you make a decision on this, then you could lose all your money because you think it's going to go back up. Well, this time it just goes straight down.
Okay. So based on like past history, people try to infer different patterns where the patterns in reality just don't exist.
Yeah.
That's the major draw line that we're trying to make.
So yeah, so like if you have a box and you fill it up with red and white like marbles, for example, and you take a marble out every time, and you've taken out 6 red ones, then the probability that you're going to pick out a what was the other color? Blue.
White.
The probability that you pick out a white one is actually going to change because
Right.
you're taking it out.
Yeah.
But when it's left in there, the probability stays entirely the same.
Yeah,
If
so-
you take one out and put it back in, every time you pick one out, the probability that the next one is going to be any different is exactly the same.
Right, yeah. And one thing we should add, you might say, well, this is silly. Why would humans even fall for this? Is because your brain, from like an evolutionary standpoint, your brain is a pattern identifying machine. That was what you're made to do. And you might ask why, and the reason is to predict the future. That's all what patterns are useful for. You don't care about the past, except the past holds information that will hopefully predict the future. But the problem is you tend to over analyze things that we've been talking about, different examples here, and sometimes you see patterns that simply aren't there,
Yeah.
but you think they are. And the reason why you think they are is because it's really a survival mechanism. So that's why this is a fallacy that we are very susceptible to.
Yeah, and the same thing happens with other species of animals too. Like, I think that there's an experiment. I'm not sure that the particular animal. I think it was a rat, but basically it was a gerbil, I think. And there was a button, and when the gerbil pushed the button, sometimes food would come down, but other times it wouldn't. But the thing is that the food falling down had nothing to do with the button at all. It just dropped on random intervals. But because sometimes it would hit the button and something would fall, or it would hit like 5 times, it would fall. It would hit 5 times, it would fall. It started believing that its hitting of that button is what caused it to fall.
And in reality, it's not.
People do the same thing. So you watch your favorite football team on Sunday, and the last 3 times you've worn your lucky shirt, they have won. But your lucky shirt has nothing to do with them winning. Or you say, like, I feel like this is going to work this time.
Yeah.
Well, just because you feel like it's going to work.
My gut tells me.
My gut tells me. I mean, I don't want to hard press intuition too much, because intuition is a very powerful mechanism. And sometimes it has the power to do stuff that is pretty incredible. But most of the time, just because your gut feels something doesn't have any influence on reality. Just because you think that the Steelers are going to win the Super Bowl has no influence on whether they actually do. And that sounds obvious.
Yeah.
But yet we're so susceptible to it because of this pattern recognition that we're involved in.
And that's a big thing about like sports fan psychology. But one thing I do want to comment on, just to counter this, is you might like wear a lucky charm whenever you play soccer. When you are playing soccer, notice the critical difference here. You're the one playing soccer, and if you don't have your lucky charm, the odds are actually you probably won't perform as well, because the lucky charm didn't actually do anything physically, but it gave you a psychological boost. When you believed that the lucky charm was helping you, and you had your lucky charm with you the next time, you actually will perform better because you believe that you're actually getting help. So that's another
And in medicine, the common thing is the placebo effect.
Right. Yeah.
You know, a doctor can give you a pill, and somehow our mind can solve the problem, even if the pill is just a sugar pill and does absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
And that just sort of illustrates the powers of our mind to solve internal issues. What the clear distinction, though, is like basing it off of internal versus the external world.
Right.
See, what if we wear a lucky shirt, it has no influence over the external world. But if we wear that lucky shirt, it might have an influence over our internal world, because if we believe it to help, then it might cause us to perform better.
Gotcha.
Just like a placebo did. So that would be the clear distinction. I do want to talk about a fallacy that I'm not particularly sure of the name of it, but I'll just describe it a little bit. But a lot of politicians push an idea like that we can always have more peace, we can always have less pollution, we can always have this, and they use these sort of buzzwords of we can always this or that to push an agenda which doesn't actually illustrate that. So they say like we can always have more fairness, and maybe they're pushing the agenda of increasing the taxes on the rich to give more money to the poor or something. But the important thing to recognize about this fallacy is that there are limitations on things. So if I say we can always have safer cars, then of course we can always have safer cars. Everyone can drive tanks around. But it's not possible. We need to make cost benefit. We need to do cost benefit analysis and determine whether that risk is good. We have risk control and aversion, and
the whole point is that not everyone can have a tank. Like there might be a limiting factor. Like we don't have literally enough material in the earth for everyone to have a tank, or enough gas to run the tank. And so the fact is that you reach a point of diminished returns for a cause, and you have to analyze that point of diminished returns versus the cost of that cause.
So to me, the best example is the Ford Pinto example. So like in the 1980s, Ford developed a car called the Pinto. And while they were developing it, they did some cost-benefit analysis and determined that if they spent $13 more, that they could prevent maybe like 200,000 deaths. But then the car would cost $13 more.
Okay.
And so when it came out, like after these people had died in these car crashes, basically, if the car was hit from behind, it would explode. So after people started dying from these car accidents, people started investigating the company, and they found out that Ford had actually done some cost-benefit analysis and figured out that they'd rather not put the part in and make the car cheaper, which really pissed people off, because they're like, how can you put a value on human life? Now, I'm not in any way saying that $13 wasn't worth it, but the point is that companies are constantly making this cost-benefit analysis. There's always a risk associated with purchasing something, and they're always putting a value on human life. So when they sell a car, they can spend $500,000 and make it incredibly safe. You know how I was talking about, like, it can always be safer. No, it can't, because it would cost $500,000 to produce, and then it would cost someone $500,000 to buy it. So one of the reasons why people buy cheaper cars is because they only have a limited amount of money to buy it. But by buying a cheaper car, they buy a car that puts them at more danger of dying. So essentially, companies have to put a value on human life. Now, whether $13 is a reasonable number or not is up for debate. But they are constantly doing that because, they could just everyone could just ride tanks around,
right.
and no one would get killed, or they could drop the speed limit to 10 miles an hour,
Right.
and no one would die in car crashes, but then it would be a pain to get anywhere.
Right, yeah, and you wouldn't even buy a car at that point. So, okay, so I get what you're saying. There's this effect where people say, oh, we're going to forward this goal, but really it's a logical fallacy because if you did forward that goal anymore, it'd be a point of diminished returns.
Yeah.
It wouldn't give you any dividends in the end for how much money you'd have to invest just to further that goal.
Yeah, so essentially it's sort of an emotional argument because you say, like, who would argue that we should have more pollution? Like, everyone would argue that we should reduce pollution, but by saying that, you're not looking at the costs of what's going into it and all of the risks associated with pushing this, and maybe where that money could go elsewhere, because money is a limited resource, time is a limited resource. So if we put all this money into reducing pollution, it's sort of the composition fallacy. We reduce pollution, but then maybe a whole nother sector of the economy is just destroyed from
Right.
it.
Okay.
And so that's something people need to remember, especially when politicians push agenda like that. Okay, so the next one is a little bit more complicated of a fallacy, but it's called post hoc ergo proto hoc.
What?
A lot of fallacies have Latin roots, and this is one of them.
Yeah.
But so in this fallacy, you say that something precedes another thing
Okay.
sequentially,
Okay.
and because it precedes something sequentially, the first thing must be the cause of the second thing.
But it's not.
But it's not. So
Okay.
the example I would think of is like the president's effect on the economy. So, okay, so Bill Clinton was president while the economy was booming.
Right.
Therefore, Bill Clinton caused the economy to boom.
Oh, so this is the classic debate of causation versus correlation.
Causation versus correlation.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is just a philosophical way to see that argument versus like the causation correlation. But yeah,
Right.
just because something is correlated does not mean that it's caused it.
Yeah, so let's say you're like an alien looking down on Earth, and whenever you see like people with these umbrellas, these like little things above their head, you notice it always rains. And so you might say, oh, when people use umbrellas, it causes it to rain. But obviously, you know it's the other way around, right? But the thing is that you didn't know what came first, the umbrellas or the rain, and you don't know what's going on. So that's where the ambiguity is. And you might say,
Now,
well,
that might be a distinction between the causation correlation
Yeah.
versus this, because in this, you actually know what comes first and what comes second, but
Right.
they aren't necessarily linked.
right. So there's a lot of other things too that appear to be linked, and you could try to develop a theory why, but in reality they're not. And you couldn't. I don't know if you could exactly prove that the president didn't cause like a boost in the economy.
Well, of course, the president's economic policy has an effect on the economy, but
Right.
like
But what was the
ultimately,
main
the
cause?
economy
Yeah.
was booming because of the internet and stuff. Or you could
Right.
say like President Bush like caused the economy to like fall
Crash,
apart.
yeah.
But as we saw last time, a lot of that had to do with like how the Federal Reserve controlled interest rates and
Right.
things of that nature. Or you say Reagan, his presidency caused the economy to boom. But I mean, of course, his policies had influence in the economy, but the president is just a small person in comparison to the whole
Right.
economy.
The whole
And the
scheme of
federal
things.
government only like controls like 40% of the economy or something. I'm not sure the specifics, but
Yeah.
to say that just because something follows, it therefore is linked is the error. And so this type of stuff happens a lot.
Gotcha. Okay.
So my personal favorite fallacy
Okay.
here. Okay, so this fallacy is just sort of the fallacy of statistics.
Okay.
So I want to talk about how statistics can be skewed to make an argument sound reasonable that is absolutely not reasonable. So I got like a little example from one of my favorite authors, Anthony Flew. He's a philosopher. I recommend you check him out. But Anthony Flew wrote about how there's this prison in Russia. So 70% of the occupants are serving their second
sentence.
or third or fourth convictions and stuff.
Right.
So from that data, we can make some inferences. We can say like, okay, this prison system must not be doing very well because the prison system's not preventing people from going back to jail. And isn't that the whole point of having jail, is to have a punishment that encourages people not to commit crimes?
Right, yeah.
So we can look at that statistics and infer that, and like we can preach that, and a lot of people are gonna buy it. Like if I go out and say that statistic, a lot of people are like, of course that's reasonable.
Yeah.
Okay, but like when we look at the statistic, it's not like that at all. Okay, so first off, in the statistic, we don't see anything about how the the sample has nothing to do with the general population. So we can't say that maybe like thousands upon thousands of people have not committed crimes to not go to jail.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't say anything about that.
Okay, yeah.
Does that make sense? Like, it just says that people in jail are the ones serving multiple sentences.
Right.
Now, here's like the crazy part. Okay, so the thing is that it doesn't mean anything that just because you went to this jail that you're somehow more likely to commit another crime, because all we're looking at is the people who are actually in jail.
The jail. Yeah.
So what?
Gotcha.
So what could happen is you committed a crime and then you decide, I'm never going to commit a crime again. That's probably what happens to most people. But because we're just looking at the sample of people in the jail,
Right. So it's living in your population
does
sample.
absolutely nothing.
Yeah,
It
gotcha.
says absolutely nothing because, of course, 70% of the people who are in the jail are serving multiple sentences. There's plenty of people who serve sentences and then didn't get sent to jail again.
Yeah,
But
right.
they're not in that population.
Right.
Seen. So
if you weren't serving a sentence, you wouldn't be in the jail.
yeah.
Okay.
so like as you see, this is like really crazy. But like when I started explaining this, what I was saying that came from it made entire sense.
Right. Yeah. So the whole point is that the way this statistic is kind of skewed is you're looking at the population sample, or the people who are in your study, and the thing is that it's unbelievable. You don't even have a control group. It's so skewed that you're only looking at the people who are in the jail as opposed to the thousands of other people normal thousands of other people who are not in the jail. And if you actually considered all those numbers, then you'd have a very different number.
So what you need to look at is the prisoners who attended the jail for the first time, and out of those, how many of those came back.
Yeah, gotcha.
Another statistic that I found really interesting, and it has to do with women and whether women get paid the same amount as men do.
Huh, okay.
I just, like, a little disclaimer is, like, I don't really want to get involved in the debate of whether, like, the workplace is fair or not. Like, I'm sure both sides have strong arguments, but I'm not trying to argue here today that, like, women are treated just as equally as men or better or whatever. I'm just pointing to a statistic and how it can be skewed to demonstrate a point.
Yeah, gotcha.
So there's a common statistic that a lot of feminists use that show that women get paid like 79 cents for every like dollar a man gets paid.
Okay.
And so you see that and you say, okay, clearly the workplace is not fair. Like women are not getting paid the same. But we need to dissect this statistic much more. But what we see is that statistic has power to influence people and their decisions. But without being dissected, the statistic is entirely meaningless.
Right.
Because firstly, what it's not looking at is if women have the same exact job as a man and work the same number of hours.
Yeah.
So if we compare women who have the same jobs, like two CEOs, a man and a woman CEO, who work the same hours, and we compare their wages, almost all of the studies show that they get paid equal. If not, the woman gets paid more in those situations.
Wow. Okay.
And so, obviously, this statistic can be misleading, but in a lot of statistics, what ends up happening is that we compare...
basically, you're not comparing the control group. You're not setting the right controls.
You're comparing apples to oranges, basically.
Right. Yeah.
And that's the fallacy.
And the other thing, too, is with this is, like, for example, like, let's just suppose, I'm just making this up, but let's just suppose, like, men tend to work overtime more than women do. Mm-hmm. So, therefore, their average salary appears to be more than women, but in reality, they're not because you didn't account for the overtime. So, the whole point is, again, looking at your population sample. And let's just say men in general tend to get higher up jobs. Now, I'm not saying this is true at all. I'm just saying, let's just suppose that is the case.
Yeah.
Then if you're then at that point, you're not really comparing men versus women. You're just comparing different types of jobs.
Different types of jobs, yeah.
With each other.
So if we really want to analyze the situation, we need to compare apples to apples, not apples to oranges. So people
you
have the same job,
right,
who work the same number of hours. We can't compare these general statistics.
And in statistics, those are called controls, by the way. Like, you want to limit as many variables as you can, so you're only comparing one variable. But a lot of times statistics don't do that. People will just want to say, I don't care about like all these controls and all these details. Just give me a number, because it's very hard to understand all these layers of controls that you have to put in here. And it can be like a headache for a researcher as well. So that's why this logical fallacy occurs all the time with statistics. And that's why you can skew statistics very easily.
Yeah, and so the general theme, though, is that we want to push across is that when someone gives you a statistic, you should not just believe it. Like, we'd like to think that, like, oh, this statistic that this politician is pushing, he's done the background work and determined that it's actually a legitimate statistic. But most of the time, we as individuals have to do that ourselves, because like, when you're pushing an agenda, any statistic you can get that is misleading to the public to push your agenda will be used. And it's like all the time this is going on.
And a counter argument to your thing, though, is you just simply don't have the time to do that. Like, when you watch a presidential debate in real time, you don't have time to look up all these statistics that they're bringing out of nowhere. I mean, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, maybe they're skewed, maybe they don't have the right control groups, maybe they haven't limited it to one variable. But you simply would have to hire an army to investigate all of this in real time to come up with a counter argument, like, in the moment. So that's a very difficult thing.
And like on that topic, though, like during the last presidential race, there was actually a website that took on the duty of doing all that work, investigating all the numbers. And so there can be sort of private institutions that can make money off of doing that, but then you have to question too, like, there's
their motives. Do they have any?
But most of the time, they can be a more viable resource. Resource.
Gotcha.
So the last fallacy I want to get to today is about genetics and the influence of the
like the genes and phenotypes,
phenotypes and stuff like that. So, like, a common argument that atheists make about people who hold religious beliefs is that the only reason why they hold those beliefs is because their parents before them held those beliefs. So there's a genetic component to holding those beliefs and an environmental component.
Right.
Or they say, like, okay, so this person in Africa was born into a family that believed that the sun was God.
Yeah.
So therefore, anybody who was born in a situation where they believed in like the Christian God, they only believe it because of the situation and the genetics. And as we can see, there's always a little bit of truth to these fallacies, and that's what makes them so enticing and usable. So yeah, of course, like if you're born into a family that holds a certain belief, you very well may hold that belief, because oftentimes our ability to understand reality is very limited. Like there's only certain resources we can look at. So if you're an atheist, you know, you don't have time to read every book that's been published and then actually objectively evaluate the decision. And just say, like, if you're a religious person, you don't have time to go through and read all the things. So we're more likely to hold the beliefs that our parents believed, because we are more are surrounded by
and influenced
by those beliefs. But this is still a fallacy, though, because just like the religious child in Africa was influenced by his parents and his genetics, so too is the atheist who's pushing this. They were influenced just in the same way.
So let's say
if this is true, is true, and that's the only reason why you hold the belief, then they too are only an atheist because they're parents, and that's when you start to see the fallacy.
Right.
Because no one can have any beliefs that are more close to truth. No one can have contrary beliefs to their parents or situations.
Wow.
And so it's a fallacy because nothing can be true, because the only reason why you believe it to be true is because it was predestined by your genetics and your environment.
Right. Okay, I see what you're saying. But let me do a little bit of a counter argument. You might, like, let's just say one of them was true. I don't have an opinion on this, but I'm just saying, like, let's say the Christianity was true. That was actually true. But because of your genetics and your environmental factors, you were predestined, I guess, or through laws of physics or whatever, you're selected to believe in Christianity. Well, then in that case, you actually are believing in the right thing, right?
Yeah, so that gets to, that's a really good point. So one thing about arguments is that we can hold the right position with the wrong premises. So the argument is not sound. A sound argument is where a conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. But okay, so let me give a quick example of this.
Sure.
So I'm going to say, because it's probably like 6 o'clock in Cuba right now, and, you know, the dictator of Cuba always goes to sleep at 5:30. The dictator of Cuba must be brushing his teeth right now.
Okay.
So I'm going to make that argument. Okay, so the conclusion doesn't at all follow from the premises, which is called a non sequitur, by the way.
Okay.
But does that mean that the conclusion is false? No, it doesn't, because he could be brushing his teeth right now.
Right.
So yes, you could believe stuff without the right background knowledge, and it could be correct.
And it could be the right solution. Yeah.
But the important thing to recognize is that I'm saying that that's not the case. The genetic fallacy is wrong because people have the ability to make change decisions and have contrary beliefs to others around them. And if they don't have that ability, then what are we arguing about? Because
then nothing
matters.
Yeah, you couldn't argue a position in the first place, because the position you're arguing would already be pre-selected by your genes and your environment. So there's nothing to argue.
Yeah.
And one of you are right or wrong. You know, that's all the bottom line. Yeah. So or you're all wrong. Yeah, it doesn't matter. You know.
Yeah.
So okay.
So I just want to end on that actually. But I do want to do one on cognitive fallacies. So if you like this one, I want to do this one on cognitive fallacies.
Trio. Yeah.
And there's a lot more logical fallacies to discuss. So if you like this topic, I recommend looking into it. And maybe we'll do another one in the future on the same topic.
Definitely. All right. Thanks guys for listening. Check out our other videos and stay tuned. Thanks.